This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Corporate governance is a system by which companies are directed and controlled. And it used to be, historically speaking, that the only real check on how companies were being governed and controlled was that every year financial statements were produced, they were audited, distributed to the shareholders, and that was the shareholders' chance to see what was happening in their company and how the directors were actually performing. The directors would hold board meetings. That was how they're supposed to be controlling the company. But one of the abuses was that if you had a very powerful director, what they would do is they would go round each of their other directors, kind of one-to-one conversations, get them on side, and then when it came to a board meeting, everything had kind of been pre-agreed. The way auditing came into it was that the company is owned by the shareholders. So they own the company, but the directors manage it. And this is sometimes called an agency relationship. The shareholders are what's known as the principals, and the directors are the agents. And as a matter of law, the agents should be acting on the best interest of the shareholders, but often they didn't. The directors prepared the financial statements. This would allow the shareholders to see what the performance was. The auditor would add credibility. The auditors were appointed by the shareholders and report to the shareholders. But a year between these financial statements being prepared, perhaps longer than a year, gave the directors lots of opportunities not to act in the shareholders' best interest, but in their own self-interest, really to enrich themselves. So this principal-agency relationship is one way of looking at it. You may sometimes see the concept of stewardship. Stewardship is the idea that the directors are stewards of the company and its assets. They should be looking after the company and its assets on behalf of the shareholders. And again, that was found to be lacking. And it was in particular in the 2000s that things came to a head. In the early 2000s, we had big scandals like Enron and WorldCom. In around 2008, we had Lehman Brothers, a large bank, going bust. And these were large, if you like, pretty well-regarded companies. They'd all been audited fairly recently, yet they went into liquidation very, very precipitously, causing ruin to many investors and employees. And people said, something has to be done. One of the approaches was the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, who put forward certain principles of corporate governance. The idea was these are principles, and each country can then try to put these principles into practice in its own particular way. What it wanted was promote transparent and efficient markets. So a transparent and efficient market means that if you have a listed company, the share price properly represents the value of the company. If the market is not transparent and you don't properly know what's going on in the company, or it's deliberately concealed, then the share price will not be tracking how the company is doing. The share price could be up there, but really the true value of the company is down there, and people are being misled. The rights of the shareholders and key ownership functions should be recognized. It is not the directors in large companies who own the company. It is the shareholders, and their rights are predominant. We should treat all shareholders equitably and fairly, particularly minority shareholders and shareholders who are abroad. It's not right to take out a shareholder, perhaps a large pension fund, take out the pension fund trustees for lunch because they happen to own 15% of the company, tell them all sorts of inside information, but to ignore the members of the public who may have substantial savings in there, but nevertheless a very small percentage of the company. You're not treating them fairly. Recognize the rights of stakeholders. We're going from shareholders to stakeholders now. So we're not just exclusively looking at shareholders for good corporate governance. Employees, employees want to be paid. They want decent employment. Another stakeholder is a supplier who wants to be paid what's due to them and so on. There is a case for saying that stakeholders should be wider, or the people you should be regarding as wider than just the shareholders. It should promote timely and accurate disclosure of all material matters. How are you going to be getting transparent and efficient markets working if you're keeping important information secret? So if a company gets an approach to be taken over, then it should make that public, because unless that's made public, you're not going to know its true value. If a company has a disaster, if a company has a bit of a disaster in a product and has to be withdrawn, then we should announce that to people, that this product is going to be withdrawn, profits may be hurt and so on. You're not doing favours to anyone by keeping them in the dark. And it sets out the responsibilities of the board, what they should be responsible for, in charge of, looking at, and so on. Another approach, and one you probably haven't seen before, because the OECD approach was probably met in F8, is the International Corporate Governance Network. Full details are given in your notes, but the sort of headings and areas it looked at was corporate objectives. It should be the objective of companies to give sustainable growth in the value of the company, not just short-term kind of lucky growth. That's, to some extent, any fool can make profits grow for a year, but it's whether you can make profits grow for year after year after year and give a sustainable and therefore lower risk ride to the shareholders. We need to set out the responsibilities of the board. For example, looking at the longer term future of the company, looking at the strategy and the like. It should promote an ethical approach, and where matters of integrity are important. We've already looked at the importance of company or corporate integrity, that if you have a company which cannot be trusted, then this causes long-term damage to the value of that company. It raises the cost of capital. There may be huge penalties to pay when unethical performance is uncovered. Risk management. This has to be dynamic. Risks grow and fall and change continuously. We have to continuously make judgments about what risks it is fair for the company and therefore the shareholders to undertake. And we should disclose our attitude to risk to the shareholders. Risk and return go hand in hand. And if we are covering up a change in risk attitude of the company, then again we're not being transparent with our shareholders. Remuneration of directors. This should be aligned with the long-term profitability and value creation of the company. So don't make bonuses too easy to get for short-term improvements of performance. If you're going to give some sort of incentive to directors, make it long-term and maybe make it aligned to share value. So giving share options is a good way. You say, in 5 years' time, you can buy the shares at this price, and this will incentivize directors to stay in for the long term for 5 years, and they want to get the share price up over 5 years. And that's a much more challenging thing to do than maybe just get the profits up for 1 year. We must have good auditing, both internal and external. We must encourage this independent investigation, really, of internal control and the figures which are being reported both to management internally and also to the shareholders in the financial statements. Disclosure and transparency. We've talked about this already. We are not doing anyone any long-term favours, except maybe the directors are keeping their jobs, but we're certainly not doing the shareholders any long-term favours if we cover up failures, if we do not disclose our successes. Again, we don't have the value of the company properly assessed, and people are being misled. Directors should be accountable to shareholders, but also the last point is quite interesting here. There are shareholder responsibilities, particularly institutions who are professionally managed and who have significant shareholdings have a responsibility to take an interest in how the company is being managed, and perhaps to raise objections at annual general meetings and ask for meetings with the board of directors if they think things aren't going well. So there's a kind of a two-way street going on here, that the shareholders must take an active interest and not just be passive recipients of what the directors are doing. We've mentioned this already a little bit in ethics, 2 approaches to corporate governance and ethics. We had the rules of compliance-based approach. The country which has adopted a particularly rules-based approach is USA, and they have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which means that if you're going to be complying with corporate governance in the USA, basically you have to sign off a lot of procedures, that this has been done, that has been done, etc. And very particular audits that the directors have done what should be done under the corporate governance rules and so on. The auditors also have to sign off. If people sign off these documents without due care, then there can be criminal sanctions brought against them. In most of Europe, we have framework and integrity-based. The emphasis is on managerial responsibility and a proper ethical approach, and proper corporate cultures. In the UK, its framework is imposed by the stock exchange, and they've taken the view that you should comply with a framework, or if you don't comply with it, you have to explain, you have to disclose and explain why not. Corporate governance, the way in which it is kind of exercised, often divides into 2 approaches in the board, unitary and 2-tier boards. Germany, for example, has gone for the 2-tier board approach, where you have a supervisory board, which is not taking day-to-day decisions on the running of the company, but supervises the management board, and in particular, it's going to be looking very closely at long-term strategic decisions. The management board takes the more day-to-day decisions on maybe what products to produce, to withdraw, etc., going on like that. Employee-type decisions, reorganization maybe of departments. So you've got the supervisory board particularly looking after the long-term sustainability and strategic decisions, and it's supervising the management board who has the, as I say, more day-to-day decisions. Information has to kind of go both ways. You have to have good communication upwards here of information, reports, results, proposals, so that the supervisory board can do its work. And then you have maybe requests for more information, judgments, warnings, control, and so on, going down the other way. There are disadvantages and advantages in both sorts here. Let's just look at a couple of on either side here. Potentially, having the two-tier system here means we can have slower decisions. If you want to take over another company, that'd be very much a strategic sort of decision. But sometimes the time gap you have available for taking over a company is quite short. You have to go in quick. And potentially having to report up to a supervisory board, have it decide its views and then kind of report them back down, can introduce delays. Information flows could be poor, either, I suppose, deliberately or accidentally. The supervisory board may not properly understand or appreciate what the management board is actually doing. On the other hand, the two-tier board gives much greater independence. They will meet, they can discuss the almost higher level issues amongst themselves, almost in privacy, without maybe interference and pressure coming from the management board. And a clear separation of roles can be important. A unitary board has been taken up, say, by the USA and, say, Britain. There is one board, but within that one board you have got both executive directors and non-executive directors. Potential disadvantages here. It can lack clear division of responsibilities in some cases. You have your executive directors sitting amongst the non-executive directors, and there's a potential of the executive directors bringing some personal pressure to bear on the non-executive directors, maybe in some cases getting on to an almost kind of bullying within the single-tier board. On the other hand, everyone knows what's going on here. In a way, there's almost much less need for communication because communication is going to happen in this single forum, and will allow fast decisions to be made. Only one vote is needed. There's no toing and froing of information flowing up and down and so on. And there are advantages in the one-tier or unitary board as well. In the UK Corporate Governance Code is our way of really implementing the OECD guidance. The purpose of corporate governance is to facilitate effective entrepreneurial and prudent management. And notice here there's a little bit of a conflict going on here. You can have prudent management, which may mean taking no risks whatsoever. And there is entrepreneurial management, where I think the common meaning of the idea is that you do need to take risks. And we'll see when we get on to looking at risk management, there is a balance to be had here. A company which takes no risks, which is very, very prudent, is likely to be one which is not perhaps going to give you great returns. If you're frightened to invest in new plant and equipment or to invest in new research and development, then your sustainability might actually be at risk. On the other hand, you don't want people to be too risk-seeking, too entrepreneurial, taking wild chances at something. And we need to get the balance right to deliver the long-term success of the company. As I said, it's comply or explain. We have an approach which is not law, but it's required by companies listed on the stock exchange. The stock exchange enforces it through a comply or explain approach. It looks at the leadership, the effectiveness, the accountability, the remuneration, and the relations with shareholders. Leadership, and again, this is old stuff for you here. Key thing about leadership, effective board look into long-term, the strategic success of the company is what they must have in mind. There should be a clear division between running the board and running the company, and that's why the roles of the Chief Executive Officer and the Chairman are split. What you don't want is one person at the top having supreme power. What you want is to split it between the CEO and the Chairman, so one is kind of watching the other. Non-executive directors should constructively challenge and develop proposals on strategy. Does it say here? Yep. And the non-executive directors should be a balance. And that means about 50%. So it's not just 5 executive board members and 1 token non-executive board member. It's 50-50 really, to get proper influence, I suppose, of these non-executive directors. The non-executive directors, a subcommittee you may remember as a nomination committee, they should be the ones who find and appoint new directors, rather than maybe existing directors, executive directors appointing their friends and cronies. There should be induction. You need a bit of training when you join the company here. There should be an evaluation of the performance of the board members. Isn't it silly if kind of everybody in the organisation had an annual review, but the people at top, arguably the most important and influential, were not reviewed? And the non-executive directors should perform regular reviews of the performance of the executive directors. Accountability. The board should present a balanced and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. This could be simply financial reporting, but we'll see in the next chapter there's something called integrated reporting. Where we begin to report much more than just the rather narrowly orientated financial results. It says the board is responsible for sound risk management and internal control systems. The board has to put in good internal control systems. How could it even pretend to manage properly if it couldn't put any reliance on the figures and reports and information coming up from lower down within the company? There must be an audit committee. The audit committee should be formed of non-executive directors. The audit committee liaises with external directors, external auditors. It should liaise with internal auditors if there are any. There don't have to be any, but the board has to really keep under continual review the need for internal audit. And most large companies now will have internal audit as a very, very important way of ensuring that their internal control system is up to the mark. Remuneration. We're not after the cheapest possible directors. You want directors who are of sufficient quality. However, what you want to make sure is that the directors are motivated to do good things for the shareholders. And interesting here, a good proportion of the director's remuneration should be linked to performance, to the company's performance. That's why something like share options are particularly good. What's good for the company is good for the share price, is good for the directors. No directors should be involved in deciding their own remuneration. There should be a remuneration committee, again with non-executive directors on it, and they decide the remuneration packages of the executive directors. Certainly in the UK, there have been some cases recently where the remuneration of the directors has been a bit outrageous, and the remuneration committee, people are wondering if it's really up to the mark. At the moment, the way things are in the UK is that the board does not does not have to have its remuneration approved by members. That may change later. Relations with shareholders. There should be a dialogue with shareholders. You must keep your shareholders informed. You must take active steps to keep the shareholders well informed, particularly when we're dealing with institutional. We would expect them to take an active role in maybe objecting to something which as shareholders don't like, objecting to something which is the directors are doing, high remuneration, taking over a company which they think should not be taken over, and the like. To some extent, if the shareholders do not take this active role in questioning directors and so on, they're almost their own worst enemies in corporate governance. Public sector governments. We have got commercial companies and we have not-for-profit companies, public sectors and NGOs. We're particularly thinking here of public sector governance, councils, government departments, maybe companies which are in public ownership there. Governance of those tends to be rather more difficult if you say take the governance of a hospital, the governance of a school. Rather more difficult because with at least a private commercial company, we know what it's there for. We know it is there to produce profits and to boost the long-term value of the company, often reflected in the share price. But what is the proper objective, say, of a hospital? Okay, you might say it is to cure people, but then you say, well, how much resource should it give to people with heart disease and people who need new hips and so on? You say, should it have any role in society to do research and development and clinical trials? You say, should it run programs to prevent disease or to screen people for early signals of the disease and so on there? You have multiple objectives, a whole lot of things to be keeping going, which makes it a little trickier. Setting and measuring the outputs can be quite difficult. How many new discoveries should a hospital produce in a year? How many new treatments should it discover? How many people should it recall for scans and so on to see if they can pick up disease earlier? What should the output be of people with heart transplants? What sort of success rate? How many should we afford versus how many hip replacements should we afford? They're working for financial constraints, and very often the financial constraints they have, they can do very little about. The financial constraints here are often given by government. So it's not like a private kind of or listed commercial organization where if it needs more money, it can put up a case for that and go out and raise more loans or to issue rights issues and so on and get people to invest. And very often in public sector organizations, the government plays a bit fast and loose. It will suddenly cut away the amount of money available to parts of the public sector because it has other priorities coming in, maybe because there's an election coming up. There are political, social, legal considerations. We can be under emphasis or under a lot of pressure, maybe from press comment, from social media, and so on. There's little competition. How do we know how well a school is doing or a hospital is doing unless we see it competing, not necessarily, or at least get benchmarks to see how well it is using the money which is being given it to by the government. You might be able to do it with different hospitals, but in some government departments it's going to be very difficult to judge, say, how the Home Office is doing or how the Foreign Office is doing or something like that. Should it be more careful with the amount of money it's giving to embassies and the like. No profit motive, not of itself a bad thing, but it can make the people in the business perhaps not seek efficiencies. It can make performance maybe a little bit harder to judge in sometimes. The 3 E's is a useful way maybe of getting into public sector governments. The 3 E's says, first of all, you should look at the efficiency, the effectiveness. And effectiveness is saying, does the public sector organization do what it is supposed to do? How effective is it at, say, curing people of disease? And some procedures will decide not to do. So in the UK, the National Health Service says we're not really into cosmetic surgery. We're not helping people, improve how they think they look, particularly. That's simply not part of our remit. We'll be looking, however, at effectiveness in curing diseases. And then you say we can look at efficiency. So having decided that you're going to cure people of a disease, there may be 3 or 4 different treatments we could use, we should be choosing the treatment which is most efficient, given maybe some sort of balance between the outcomes, the way people are actually cured, and the cost of actually getting those outcomes. And finally then there is economy. Having decided how you're going to carry out a particular treatment, maybe which drug you're going to use, then it makes sense to go to the drug manufacturers and get a really good deal for them. Buy in bulk. Maybe make it a performance-related payment so that the drug company only gets paid on the basis of people who are cured. If you like, almost an ordinary commercial type of approach. The public sector performance matrix is shown here, which may or indeed may not give some guidance to local and indeed central government about how it should proceed with certain initiatives, certain types of expenditure. And it looks at the value for money and, in a way, how much the public treasures the particular public service. So if we had something which is very good value for money, and which the public really appreciate, then any sensible politician will go for that. For a relatively little bit of taxpayers' expenditure, or a small amount of taxpayers' money being spent, we're doing something which the public like, which may or may not be of value, but at any rate the public like, and it's going to help you be elected again. So that is a public sector star. If you have something which is of low value money, quite expensive, quite difficult, taking a lot of revenue from the taxpayer, and we're not getting very yet nevertheless the public seems to treasure this in some way, we've got quite a difficult one going on here. How should we handle that one politically? And one way might be to try to educate the public, to try to say, look, this is not a good way of spending your taxpayers' money. Why do you like it? Why do you think it's attractive? And some governments might think of what's known as hypothecating tax. They say, right, if you want the government to do this, we will raise a particular levy to do that. We'll use this money to pay for that public service. And this tends to bring it home to people. Okay, you can have this public service which you like, but it's costing a lot of money. Do you still really like it? Here's pretty easy. It's bad value for money and nobody's interested anyway, so just kind of get that off the agenda. That's not great. If something is good value for money, but the public aren't very interested in it. There's a slight bit of a dilemma there. If the public's not interested in it, maybe we could abandon it. Or what we could do, if we think it's good for the public, it's good value for money, maybe we can educate the public. We can say, look, for spending a little bit of money, we can maybe put in this form of, medical type of intervention. And look, think about it again. Wouldn't you want that? Don't you think that's a really quite good way of spending moderate amount of tax revenue?